be very helpful for your reporting. As you can see in our latest global World Economic Outlook, we have a reference forecast, we have an adverse scenario, and a severe scenario. But what is best to discuss the granularity of the latest edition of the World Economic Outlook, that to be joined here today by Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas. He is the director of the research department, also economic counselor. Next to him are Petya Koeva Brooks. She's deputy director of the research department. And last but not least, we have Deniz Igan. She is division chief with the research department. As usual, we're going to start with Pierre-Olivier's opening remarks, and then after that, we are going to proceed to your questions. So without further ado, Pierre-Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose, and good morning, everyone. So despite major trade disruptions and policy uncertainty, last year ended on an upbeat note. The private sector adapted to a changing business environment, helped by lower than announced US tariffs, fiscal support in some countries, favorable financial conditions, and a tech boom. Despite downside risks, this momentum was expected to carry into 2026, and we were looking to lift up our global growth forecast. Now, war in the Middle East has halted this momentum. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz and serious damage to critical energy facilities in the Middle East raised the prospect of a major energy crisis should a durable solution not be found soon. Oil and gas prices have increased sharply, and so have the prices of diesel and jet fuel, fertilizer, aluminum, and helium. The overall impact will depend on three channels. First, higher commodity prices are a textbook negative supply shock, raising prices and costs, disrupting supply chains, and eroding purchasing power. Second, these effects may be amplified as firms and workers try to recoup losses, risking wage price spirals, especially where inflation expectations are poorly anchored. Third, financial conditions could tighten, with lower asset valuations, higher risk premia, capital flight, dollar appreciation, dampening demand. Our report presents three scenarios. Our reference forecast assumes a short-lived conflict and a moderate 19% rise in energy prices in 2026. Still, some damage will not be avoided. Global growth falls to 3.1% this year, a downgrade from January forecast, and headline inflation rises to 4.4%. Our adverse scenario assumes further disruption, leading to higher energy prices.
Bueno, hoy en Negocios Televisión estamos siguiendo en directo las previsiones de primavera del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Estamos viendo cómo la entidad está recortando sus previsiones de crecimiento debido a la situación en el estrecho de Hormuz y a esa guerra que estamos viendo en Irán. Están advirtiendo que los precios de la energía van a acelerar la inflación y que también les ha llegado a revisar a la baja las previsiones de crecimiento para el próximo año 2026.
Low-income energy importers are highly exposed, especially those with pre-existing vulnerabilities and limited buffers. But the damage is most severe for countries in the Gulf. Today's shock echoes the 2022 commodity price surge. Then, central banks delivered a successful disinflation without a recession. Can we expect the same outcome now? There are reasons to doubt it. In 2022, inflation pressures were already elevated by post-pandemic support policies. Today, underlying demand pressures have eased, though inflation remains above target in some countries, notably the United States. If the shock remains modest, inflation may be more contained, consistent with our reference scenario. Still, the last episode left scars. Higher prices raised cost of living concerns and made inflation expectations potentially more sensitive to new price increases. And the 2022 surge reflected an unusually steep aggregate supply curve from supply bottlenecks, enabling disinflation with limited output losses. Our analysis shows the supply curve is now much flatter, making any central bank engineered disinflation more costly in terms of unemployment. So what should policymakers do? Let's start with central banks. This is a negative supply shock, and no central bank can influence global energy prices on its own. Markets are already pricing in higher policy rates. However, provided inflation expectations remain well anchored, central banks can afford to wait and watch for now. But they must be attentive to risks and communicate clearly their readiness to act decisively.
Bueno, estamos viendo cómo el Fondo Monetario Internacional viene a repetir los mensajes que dejaba Georgieva la semana pasada en ese discurso de presentación. Dice el Fondo Monetario Internacional en esta presentación de las perspectivas de primavera que de momento los bancos centrales a nivel mundial se pueden permitir esperar a ver qué sucede con la situación en los próximos meses.
But they distort prices. They're often poorly designed, hard to unwind, and extremely costly. Most countries don't have that luxury anymore. Where support for the most vulnerable is needed, targeted and temporary measures should be deployed, consistent with medium-term plans to rebuild fiscal buffers, and avoiding stimulating demand where inflation is rising. Finally, if financial conditions tighten sharply, as in our severe scenario, and global activity deteriorates markedly, monetary and fiscal policy should be ready to pivot to support the economy and safeguard the financial system alongside appropriate financial and liquidity policies. Now, the war demands immediate attention.
Bueno, también en el plano fiscal, el Fondo Monetario Internacional está dejando mensajes. Dice que los gobiernos también deben proponer medidas objetivas y centradas para ayudar a las economías sin intentar también acelerar esa demanda que podría provocar también un shock en la economía y, por lo tanto, aumentar aún más la inflación, que ya se va a ver también bastante incrementada debido a ese shock de los precios energéticos provocados por la situación en Oriente Próximo. Así que mismos mensajes que ya adelantaba la directora del Fondo Monetario Internacional y que también está dejando en esta rueda de prensa la institución tras presentar esas previsiones, esas proyecciones para este año 2026.
Policies such as trade restrictions undermine cooperation and growth. Growing strains on international order are pushing toward a multipolar world. But a more multipolar world need not be a more fragmented one. In fact, countries are finding new trade partners and forming trade agreements beyond traditional geopolitical lines. We should keep strengthening global cooperation with the right policies, including a swift cessation of hostilities and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The damage can remain limited. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. And now we are going to turn to your questions, but let me remind some ground rules. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait until I call on you. If I do, identify yourself and the media outlet that you represent. This time around, just to try to take as many questions as possible, I'm going to be rounding questions and grouping them. So stay tuned for that. Also, we are here to discuss the world economic outlook. Questions regarding programs, negotiations, or institutional matters are not for this forum, but basically you will have...
Bueno, mensajes que dejaba el director financiero del Fondo Monetario Internacional, Pierre-Olivier, ha dejado un mensaje también optimista al finalizar esa presentación. Ha dicho concretamente que una cooperación y una apertura del estrecho de Hormuz podría facilitar un mejor escenario para la economía a nivel global. Veremos a ver ahora cómo responde a las preguntas de los asistentes a esta rueda de prensa del Fondo Monetario Internacional.
Adverse scenario is more probable now, and in that case, you still think that central banks should wait and see? I'm talking about the 2.5 growth scenario. And also, with all these shocks that the IMF highlights that are more permanent and they're coming more frequently, do you expect to, or are you thinking of updating the wheel more often throughout the year? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. We're going to take another question. I'm going to go to the front here. Don't worry, we will go to more rounds, so stay patient.
Good morning. Noor Ammasha from Asharq Bloomberg. Pierre, how concerned are you about the strong dollar at this point dampening the efforts of growth and inflation containment, especially that this strength of the dollar is increasing with all the inflation expectations? Thank you.
Okay, another global question that will be the last. I'm going to go with the gentleman here.
Barry Wood, the American Dispatch column, the Daily Friend. Pierre, you're an economic historian. How do you compare this oil shock with the two in the 1970s?
Perfect. Pierre-Olivier.
So let me address these questions. So first on the scenario. So precisely because we are in a very fluid environment, and you can see the news every day, things are changing in a material way. We felt that we had to, instead of having a baseline, have something, our reference forecast, and then supplement that with other scenarios that would look at more extreme developments in energy markets. The reference forecast has as its core an assumption of a relatively limited conflict that gets resolved in the second half of the year, and then with energy prices that are normalizing in that second half of the year and then into next year. Very clearly, with every day that passes where we don't have a resolution, where the flow of oil and
Bueno, le están preguntando al jefe económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional, Pierre, dice que le han preguntado cuál es el escenario ahora mismo que tiene encima de la mesa el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Ha dicho que en el mejor de los escenarios, en un conflicto limitado y que se resuelva rápido, esperan que los precios de la energía se recuperen en la segunda mitad del año. Dice también que la situación ahora mismo en Oriente Medio es bastante volátil y que por lo tanto es difícil ahora mismo ver la situación cómo va a proceder o cómo va a evolucionar en los próximos meses. Un escenario adverso es ahora mismo un escenario bastante optimista. Es lo que tienen encima de la mesa, y también dice también que tiene un escenario adverso también en mente a la hora de realizar estas proyecciones. Y como decimos, un mensaje importante dice que en caso de que el conflicto finalice pronto, esperan que los precios de la energía se normalicen en la segunda mitad del año 2026.
And so our next rendezvous point will be when we have our WEO update in July. On the dollar and the impact that this may have, this is one of the channels through which financial tightening can affect emerging and developing economies. Typically, when we have uncertainty in the global economy, when there is a risk-off episode, investors look for safety. They move their assets towards safer assets. Often that means U.S. Treasuries or similar type of assets, and that is associated with the dollar appreciation. This is what we've seen in the wake of the war in the Middle East. It's been a modest appreciation by historical standards, but nonetheless it's an appreciation. And that appreciation is creating inflation pressures in other countries. They see a depreciation of their currency from their end. And it also is tightening financial conditions because many of these countries have dollar liabilities. So that's certainly making things more difficult for them. And that's one of the channels that we explore also in our adverse and our severe scenario. Now, how does it compare to previous oil price shocks? I made a reference in my opening remarks to 2022. That's the most recent energy surge that we had.
Bueno, advertencia también que está lanzando Pierre-Olivier, el director económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Le han preguntado por la situación del dólar y cómo afecta eso al resto de economías a nivel mundial. Dice que sin duda esa apreciación del dólar a nivel global está provocando también presiones en la inflación. Está ahora hablando también de cómo se compara esta crisis o este shock energético que se podría o que se está produciendo ya en los mercados con la crisis energética de los años 70. Veremos a ver qué dice Pierre-Olivier, jefe económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional.
There are, however, two important differences compared to that shock. The first one is that the global economy is much less oil dependent now than it was back then. There are many other sources of energy, renewables, nuclear, and other things. And also the global economy has become much more efficient in terms of how much it needs oil to produce GDP. And so that's a source of resilience, if you want. The second source of resilience has to do with policies. Back in the 70s, central banks looked first and foremost to try to support activity and not try to rein in inflation. And that led to macroeconomic instability, what was initially a relative price shock, the price of oil increasing relative to other prices, morphed into an inflation problem, all the prices and wages going up. Central banks have learned. They've built frameworks, they've become more independent, they've adopted frameworks that allow them to focus on price stability, and everyone knows that, and therefore they have, whether households or the private sector, inflation expectations remain fairly low because they believe central banks will deliver on their mandate. That's a critical difference with what we had also in the 70s, and that's something that is going to be important going forward.
Bueno, a esa pregunta que le realizaban a Pierre-Olivier sobre cómo comparaba esta crisis actual respecto a la crisis que también se vio en los años 70 y que era parecida a la que estamos viviendo actualmente, dice que antes las economías eran más dependientes de los combustibles y que ahora esa economía ya no existe actualmente, que es menos dependiente de esas energías o de esos carburantes que proceden de Oriente Próximo, y ha dicho también que antes los bancos centrales se centraban en mantener la actividad y que ahora lo que se centran es en intentar anclar esa inflación y que, por lo tanto, esas son las dos principales diferencias que ve Pierre-Olivier, director económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional, en esta crisis que estamos viendo en Oriente Medio respecto a la que vimos hace bastantes años, en los años 70, que también procedía de la misma zona.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. So these two questions are very related to the previous one that was asked. So the lesson from that period is you don't want to let an energy shock turn into an ongoing inflation problem. So this is why in my remarks I said, of course, central banks cannot do anything about the price of oil, but they can do something about preventing the emergence of wage price spirals, the de-anchoring of inflation expectations, and they're expected to do that. So they don't have to step on the brakes right away. They can afford for the major central banks, whether we're looking at the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, or the Bank of England, we don't necessarily think that they need to raise interest rates right away. But if they see signs that inflation is taking hold, that if they see signs that there are wage price spirals, if they see signs that households and businesses start expecting a more permanent and persistent inflation, then they will need to take action. And that's one of the big lessons that has been learned in the 70s and that we should not forget. The other lesson from that period is the importance, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the importance of energy diversification. It's very clear that the best way, and that was something that a number of countries did already in the 70s, and many more countries will do now, is to find ways in which they can diversify their sources of energy, rely more on sources of energy that they can produce domestically. Often that means renewables, and so we're likely to see a big push in that direction. So inflation is going to be there. If you look at our forecast, we're projecting 4.4% inflation this year. That's headline inflation. And we're projecting a slight increase in core inflation. But under our reference forecast, this is expected to fade away into next year. And in 2027, we would be back on the disinflation path that we've been on for the last few years. Of course, if the shock gets larger, if the disruptions get more severe, then we could get more of an inflation shock that would last more into next year. And under our severe scenario, for instance, inflation would rise to 5.8% this year and 6% next year. So those would be much higher levels of inflation.
Okay, I'm going to turn to WebEx first. I just want to remind everyone that we have reporters joining us on WebEx and through the press center. So I see Ikai, please, where coming?
Yes, Goer, E-Time Media Group. A question on China. So growth in China for 2026 is revised upward by 0.2 percentage point relative to October to 4.4% this year. And it's a modest markdown compared to the January projection. So how do you assess the impact of this conflict on the Chinese economy and its resilience in weathering external shocks? Thank you.
And before we answer this question, as we are in China, Asia, any other question in the room on the region? Please, the lady in the first row.
Bueno, mensajes que ha seguido dejando el director económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Ha vuelto a reiterar que los bancos centrales no necesitan subir los tipos de interés inmediatamente y que tienen esa capacidad de ver y esperar a ver qué sucede con esa situación en el Oriente Próximo y cómo podría afectar a las economías a nivel global, sobre todo ese shock energético que repite el Fondo Monetario Internacional, que va a afectar la inflación a largo plazo.
So on China, yes, we have a slight downward revision compared to our January forecast for China to 4.4%. We were projecting in January 4.5%. And it is an upward revision from October. There's been, the Chinese economy has been doing quite well in the last part of last year. And so some of this is a carryover, if you want, from the strong performance in 2025. But then, of course, there is some impact of the war in the Middle East. Some of the revision upward is also related to the reduction in tariffs that in January, following the decision by the US Supreme Court to rule out IEEPA tariffs, that lowers the effective tariff rate that the Chinese economy is facing, even if some of it has been replaced by Section 122. And so overall, that also helps the Chinese economy. And finally, there is some additional fiscal support that has been provided. So all of this together leads to a modest correction for the Chinese growth number in 2026 relative to what we had in January under the reference forecast. Now, the Chinese economy remains an economy that is expected to see its growth rate come down. So it was 5% in 25, now it's 4.4, and it's expected to be 4% in 27. And that reflects some of the domestic imbalances in that economy between an export sector that is doing quite well. There have been very strong performance on the export side, but a domestic side of the economy, domestic consumption, that's still fairly weak. And going forward, that's becoming more and more of a headwind for the Chinese economy to try to grow essentially through the external sector, and there is a need to rebalance the growth drivers from the external sector to the domestic sector. That's something that we've emphasized in our consultations with the authorities. On the question that was asked about debt for emerging market economies, now, the starting point here, and we had the whole chapter of our report in October, is one where emerging market economies have been weathering the recent shocks fairly well, maybe better than anyone would have anticipated. They've demonstrated a huge amount of resilience to the inflation surge, to the COVID period. So the last 10, 15, 20 years have been a period where emerging market economies have really improved their macroeconomic policy making, their frameworks. And that resilience is likely to be tested. A number of them have elevated debt levels. They don't have a lot of room on the fiscal side, and therefore...
Bueno, también le han preguntado por una de las principales economías a nivel mundial al economista jefe del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Ha dicho concretamente que China se ha visto favorecida por esas tarifas más bajas procedentes de Estados Unidos y ha dicho también advertencia que ha lanzado, ha dicho que prevé que la economía china se desacelere el próximo año debido a una baja demanda a nivel interna. Así que mensaje también de advertencia para una de las principales economías a nivel global como es China por parte del economista jefe del Fondo Monetario Internacional.
The impact, you expect the impact of rising energy prices to linger in the UK. Why is that?
Okay, any other questions on the UK? Don't worry, we will get to more rounds. I'm just trying to be as effective as possible.
Yeah, Alex Brummer from the Daily Mail. The UK has a history of wage price inflation, and indeed there are industrial disputes going on at the moment in the National Health Service. I just wondered if you fear that the UK could be back into a wage price cycle of the 1970s.
And before you answer, Pierre-Olivier, we have another question from Tim Wallace from The Telegraph, also saying, please, can you expand on the reasons for the UK downgrade?
Yes, very happy to do that. So on the UK downgrade, we have, the UK's numbers are revised down for 2026 by 0.5 percentage point. So we're projecting a growth rate of 0.8%. Now, there are two main reasons for this. The first one is the war in the Middle East, of course, and I'll expand on that in a minute. But there is also the fact that there was a relatively weak performance of the UK economy in the second half of last year. And the way the numbers are computed, there is what we call a carryover. So there is a kind of a shadow effect of that growth into 2026. And that also contributes to a lower growth number overall. But there is an expectation of a rebound in 2027, and growth is expected to be at 1.3%. Now, the impact of the war in the Middle East for the UK is, of course, coming through energy price, and in particular gas prices. And the UK is highly reliant on gas for its energy mix. Now, a lot of this gas is produced domestically, but there is still a part of it that is
Bueno, más mensajes que está dejando Pierre-Olivier, director económico del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Ahora está hablando también de otra economía bastante importante, Reino Unido. Dice que está siendo afectada sobre todo a nivel de los precios de la energía. Concretamente, está hablando de la alta dependencia que tiene Reino Unido del gas en su mix energético. Así que también advertencias que está dejando para la economía británica. Dice que espera que la economía se desacelere este próximo año, pero esperan un rebote para el año 2027.
In the UK. Now, even we are revising up inflation for the UK as well. Headline inflation, we're expecting 3.2% next year. But we're not moving very much our estimate for core inflation. It's expected to be above 2%, but only marginally up from what we were projecting in January, around 2.7%. And the reason for that, and that's how I'm getting to the question about the wage price spiral, is the UK economy still has a negative output gap in our estimates. So there is quite a bit of slack, and that actually is moderating some of the wage pressures. Now, we'll have to see and watch how the increase in energy prices, especially when they get to consumers, whether that translates into a different dynamic. But right now, there is little evidence that there are strong wage pressures in the UK economy, and therefore, under the reference forecast, our estimates of core inflation are not increasing too much.
Okay, we have a question regarding Europe that comes from Gianluca di Don Francesco Il Sole 24 Ore. Will it be right thing to do for the EU to put on hold its stability pact? That's one. Any other questions regarding European countries in the room? I'm going to go to the gentleman there.
Yes, Hugo Dixon, Reuters. I have a question. Have you done an analysis of if there are tolls on the Strait of Hormuz, whether that will be primarily absorbed by the consumers in Europe and elsewhere, or by the producers?
I think we can go ahead.
Right, on the question of the EU Stability and Growth Pact, I mean, our assessment is that a number of European economies really need to bring rebuild their fiscal buffers, bring their deficits, especially their structural deficits, down. And they are on their way doing that under the EU rules. It's a multi-year plan, so they have objectives in 2029, 2030, 2031. They don't do it in one go, but they are on their path to get there. And it's very important to stay the course. It's very important to continue rebuilding those fiscal buffers, not deviate, not suspend the rules, because there is the energy price shock. And if measures need to be taken, again, to support maybe the most dependent or the most vulnerable categories of households or some businesses, maybe, that are more dependent on energy, then those measures can be implemented, but they can be very, very targeted. They can be very temporary as well. What we've seen in the 2022 episode is a number of measures have been adopted, often very costly, 2 to 3% of GDP.
Bueno, le han preguntado también a Pierre-Olivier, el economista jefe del Fondo Monetario Internacional, sobre si los países de la Unión Europea debían suspender ese plan de estabilidad que quieren llevar a cabo debido al impacto macroeconómico que la situación en Oriente Próximo podría tener en las economías. Pierre-Olivier ha dicho que concretamente no. Dice que las medidas, en caso de que fuesen necesarias por parte de los gobiernos a nivel fiscal, deberían ser muy limitadas y también muy concretas, porque vuelve a repetir lo que advertía también Cristina Georgieva la semana pasada, de que ese buffer, ese límite fiscal por parte de los gobiernos a nivel global sigue siendo bastante limitado. Lo ha comparado a las medidas que se tomaron ya en el año 2022 a raíz de la guerra en Ucrania.
The lady on the first row.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Nume Ekege from This Day newspaper, Nigeria. Given the tighter global financial conditions, what strategies does IMF recommend for African countries, especially Nigeria, to maintain investor confidence? And also, there's been a downgrade on Nigeria's outlook from 4.4 to 4.1. Can you tell us what's responsible for that downgrade? Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions on Sub-Saharan Africa countries? I see the gentleman next. Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Desmond Okon. I write for the Cable News Nigeria. So Nigeria is targeting a single-digit inflation of between 6 to 9%. Given the current global shocks, how realistic is that? That's one. All three warring countries are close to the fund. Apart from all you do and your core functions, is there any internal engagement on the part of the fund to see what they can do to potentially end the war? Thank you very much.
So on Sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, we are seeing, just very broadly, and then I'll turn it over to Deniz, we are seeing some downgrade of growth, and we are seeing some uptick in inflation in a number of countries in the region. So the impact is very much along the lines.
Bueno, otra pregunta también que ha pasado desapercibida, pero que carece de bastante importancia. Le han preguntado a Pierre-Olivier sobre si ese peaje que quiere imponer o que dice Irán que se está llevando a cabo ya en el estrecho de Hormuz va a tener un peso en los productores o en los consumidores. Pierre-Olivier dice que es difícil determinar ahora mismo el impacto de ese peaje que en principio ya se está llevando a cabo según Irán, pero que en caso de que tenga una consecuencia va a caer sobre todo, dice, en el lado de los consumidores. Así que también mensajes que está dejando Pierre-Olivier sobre ese peaje que se está llevando a cabo en el estrecho de Hormuz, tal y como ha indicado también Irán.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier, and thank you for the question on Sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular in Nigeria as well. So for Sub-Saharan Africa, we need to, taking a step back, actually 2025 was a relatively strong year, and before the war began, global growth prospects being resilient, and non-oil commodity prices being strong, and external financial conditions being supportive actually helped a lot of countries in the region. Now, with the war, we have reduced global growth and softened prices for non-oil commodities, and also worsened terms of trade for oil importers, and that's an important aspect for variation within the region as well. And on top of that, the region is also facing significant challenges from headwinds from declining foreign aid, which on the bilateral aid cuts range from 16 to 28% in 2025, and we project that trend to continue. Now, how is that affecting the economy? As Pierre-Olivier said, we have a downgrade on growth by 0.4 percentage point cumulatively for 26 and 27, and at the same time, median inflation in Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to go up from 3.4% in 2025 to 5% in 2026. And that's all reflecting the high oil and fertilizer prices, fuel shortages potentially, and rising borrowing costs. And fertilizer prices in particular are a concern for the region because of its dependence on agricultural products as well, and existing level of food insecurity. Now, turning to Nigeria quickly, we have revised down Nigerian growth as well by 0.3 percentage point to 4.1 in 2026, and that is reflecting a balance of two forces. One is that the war-related higher fuel and fertilizer prices and higher shipping costs that I mentioned are going to weigh on non-oil activity in Nigeria. There's some offset coming from higher oil prices, but at the end of the day, the balance is for therefore weighing on growth in 26, with some recovery built in 2027. As far as inflation developments go, we believe that tight monetary policy and remaining data dependent and watching very carefully both exchange rate movements and inflation expectations is going to be crucial to achieve the inflation target of the central bank.
Okay, we have 10 minutes and 2 regions to cover. We're going to go to the Middle East. I'm going to go first to WebEx. I see Doha in the WebEx. So Doha, please come in.
Hello, Jose. Thank you so much for taking my question. Good morning, Pierre, Petya, and Deniz. Happy Easter all, and good morning for all colleagues. I have 2 questions. My first one is the MENA region. Pierre, you have said that the impacts of the regional war will be severe on the oil exporters in the region. What about the oil importers in terms of the debt, inflation, and GDP growth expectations? My second question is a country-focused one. It's in Egypt. The report showed that the IMF has reduced its projections for the GDP growth for the country amid the ongoing war. Could you please elaborate more on that? Thank you so much.
Any other questions in the room? I see Kyle there, and then I will try to bundle another one. If it's on the Middle East, then we will go to Western Hemisphere and Latin America. Please, Kyle, go ahead.
Good morning, Kyle Fitzgerald with The National. Thank you for taking my question. I just want to go back to what Pierre-Olivier said earlier, that we're sort of drifting closer to this adverse scenario. So how do you imagine this adverse scenario playing out in the Middle East, both regards to the short-term and the medium-term outlook? Thank you.
Any additional question? Gentleman here.
Good morning. I'm Fabrice Naudelanga from Le Figaro, based in Paris. Could you elaborate a bit about the figures you give for Saudi Arabia? Of course, you downgrade its growth forecast, but it still should grow in the reference scenario by over 3%. How do you explain this? And can you elaborate a bit about the very severe figures you give for Qatar and Iraq? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, of course, the MENA region is very heavily affected, and you can basically think of, broadly speaking, 3 groups of countries. You have the conflict countries, and that includes a number of energy exporters, but really the dominant force for them is the fact that they are in the path of war right now. And that leads to very significant downgrades and sometimes even negative growth rates for a number of them. Then you have energy exporters that are not necessarily in the conflict region. They can benefit from increase in energy prices, even though their population might also be affected by some of the effects of the energy crisis in the form of higher energy prices or potentially food prices down the line. And then you have energy importing countries in the region, and they're affected like many other countries around the world through higher their reliance on energy coming from the Gulf region, and how it's affecting both the cost of energy, transportation, and potentially down the line again, food prices. So that's kind of the broad overview. The adverse scenario would make things worse. The adverse scenario assumes that energy prices are higher than what we have in the reference forecast. It's still a relatively short-lived disruption, so we're expecting energy prices to normalize in 2027 back to around $75 a barrel for oil, for instance, but a more acute and more severe disruption. And of course, the countries in the region are going to be more severely affected. Now, on the more granular country-specific, I will turn to Petya.
Thank you. Let me start with a question on Egypt. There we have downgraded our forecast for this year in 2026 to 4.2, which is a downward revision of 0.5. And like other energy importers, Egypt is among one of the countries affected by the developments by the war, and the higher oil prices are going to reduce real income, they're going to dampen consumption, and also the uncertainty is going to affect investment. So these are the main factors behind the downgrade, which is, by the way, not only for 2026, but also for 2027. Now, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, we saw very strong growth there in 2025, which was boosted by the rebound in oil production then, as well as non-oil activities. But then this year, with the start of the war, we have a significant downward revision in our growth forecast. The revision is in the order of about 1.4. So the growth rate that we right now have for 2026 is 3.1. Now, this revision, the biggest factor behind it is the downgrade in the oil activity in the country, and that revision of the oil GDP is a little bit over 3 percentage points. So it's really sizable, which reflects the lower production, which is related to the disruptions due to the war, although there has been some rerouting, which is a mitigating factor. At the same time, we also have lower non-oil activity, as in other regions, the higher commodity prices also lead to lower real income and lower domestic activity. Let me stop here.
Okay, we're going to go through a last round, and we have a region that we haven't touched upon. It's the Western Hemisphere, and I'm including Latin America here. First of all, we have a question from Oglovo. How is Brazil positioned to deal with global shocks? I'm going to go to the room. Any other? I see my Argentine friends there. So Paula, Guillermo, please go ahead.
Thank you. Paula Lugones, for Clarín, Argentina. The outlook revised down Argentina's growth forecast for this year. Was it because of the impact of the war, or there are some other reason? Because Argentina is an oil exporter. And also, can you please also elaborate a bit about the inflation forecast? Thank you.
We have a similar question from Infobae regarding Argentina's inflation. Very quickly, I just can get one question here, and then we need to move on, because we have literally 3 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Miguel Moscosa from Merceo, Mexico City. Bueno,
estamos encarando ya la rueda final de esta presentación de las proyecciones por parte del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Ha lanzado advertencias, como ya lo hacía la propia Cristina Georgieva la semana pasada en la presentación de estas reuniones de primavera de la entidad, sobre todo recortes de previsiones de crecimiento a nivel global, también revisión al alza de la inflación y advertencias sobre lo que puede provocar si la situación se alarga a largo plazo. También mensajes de optimismo que ha dejado Pierre-Olivier, que está también ya dejando más mensajes respondiendo a las últimas preguntas sobre la situación en diferentes regiones. Ha dicho Pierre-Olivier que la situación más optimista, si el conflicto se soluciona rápido, esperan que los precios de la energía se normalicen para la segunda mitad del año. Ha dicho también que esa apreciación del dólar que estamos viendo a nivel global está provocando también presiones en la inflación, y sobre las políticas que pueden aplicar tanto bancos centrales como gobiernos, ha dicho que los bancos centrales de momento se pueden permitir esperar a ver qué sucede con ese shock energético a nivel global, y que en caso de que las medidas fiscales fuesen necesarias deben ser bastante limitadas y también bastante focalizadas para evitar que siga aumentando ese déficit fiscal que ya es bastante alto y que se debe reducir en los próximos años. Así que esos son los mensajes que ha ido dejando Pierre-Olivier, el director de Economía del Fondo Monetario Internacional, finalizando ya esta rueda de prensa de presentación de las proyecciones de la entidad.
And I think that is the main factor. As you pointed out, Argentina is as a net exporter, so the positive impact of the improved terms of trade is also offset by the fact that, with the higher commodity prices and the higher and the inflation that is eroding real income, and as in other countries, that works in the opposite direction. Now, when it comes to inflation, we saw inflation come down from 118% at the end of 2024 to 31.5% at the end of 2025. We are expecting the disinflation process to continue, but a bit more gradually than in our previous forecast. And then finally, just a few words on Mexico, where we do have a slight upward revision in our forecast. We are expecting now growth to be 1.6 this year and 2.2 next year. Part of that, again, is because of developments that already happened in 2025. We did see stronger than expected momentum at that point. So, and on top of that, we also have the lower than expected tariffs than in our previous forecast. So that is offsetting the impact of the war. And when it comes to the US MCA, we've noted that negotiations have started. I think it's too early to evaluate outcomes and such, and this is something that we'll be doing as we have more clarity on the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Petya, Pierre-Olivier, Deniz, and thank you all of you for attending this press briefing. There's going to be other opportunities during the week to continue asking questions. I want to remind you that the Global Financial Stability Report press briefing is taking place in this same room around 10:30 a.m. Tomorrow, stay tuned for the Fiscal Monitor and the press briefing from the Managing Director. And then later on the week, all those regional press briefings. On behalf of Pierre-Olivier, Petya, Deniz, the Research Department, Communications Department, thank you very much. Any questions, comments, feedback, media@imf.org. Thank you very much.